Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Peter Hajj. I'm a future leader in this year's program in 2022. And I'm very, very happy and privileged to be here today and sharing the first session of what looks like a great program. So I'm looking forward to sharing the first panel discussion and welcoming our great presenters today. And thanks very much for everyone who attending in person, but also everyone who's joining us online. So our first session today is on tackling the big picture. And this is a very, very interesting topic and a very important framing for today's session. So the problems facing society and indeed the world today are complex and cannot be tackled in isolation. They are multifaceted, requiring the ability to work across traditional boundaries. So in today's session, we're going to discuss basically the interdependency and the complexity of today's world and how can we address these challenges. There was a recent publication last week from the Joint Committee on the National Security Strategy, which touched on the readiness for the storms ahead on critical national infrastructure in the age of climate change. And in that report, they touched on how complex today's world has become, and touching on how the focus on the connection between different systems is important to understand that complexity and to address the challenges. So I'm very, very looking forward for the presentation today and for the panel discussion. And to briefly introduce our first speaker, Professor Sir Adrian Smith. Adrian Smith became president of the Royal Society on 30 November 2022. He is also Institute Director and Chief Executive of the Alan Turing Institute. He is a mathematician with expertise in Bayesian statistics. He was Director General of Knowledge and Innovation at BIS, now BASE, and has worked with the UK Higher Education Funding and Research Council. Adrian is chair of the board of the Diamond Light Source and is also a board member of the UK Atomic Energy Authority. Without further ado, I would like to invite Adrian on stage to give his speak.
Well, thank you for that introduction and to the Foundation for having me here today. I'd like to start just with a few words about the Royal Society, which I think helps to frame the discussion about the challenges we face as a global community and the role that science and technology can play in addressing those challenges. The Royal Society, as many of you will know, has been around for a very long time, since 1660. Not as long as the Worshipful Company of Glaziers, actually, but we are the oldest scientific community in continuous existence in the world. Christopher Wren was one of the founders, and if you look across the river, you'll see part of his legacy. Our founding mission, which is reflected in the Society's charter, is, I think, important and frames a lot of what we want to talk about today. Our aims are to recognize, promote, and support excellence in science, okay, but then the next bit, and to encourage its development and use for the benefit of humanity. So that's science in a broad sense, crossing disciplines from discovery through to application. So that's the context in which I use the word science. So many achievements over the years, which have been fundamental to our understanding of the world around us. Publication of Newton's Principia Mathematica, which we actually have the copy in Carlton House Terrace. If you're very good and very successful and very nice to me, come and see it. Benjamin Franklin's kite experiment, which was demonstrating the electrical nature of lighting, many other things. The Society actually backed James Cook's journey to Tahiti, and now we have Australia and New Zealand, to trace the transit of Venus. And we published the first report in English of inoculation against disease, approved Babbage's difference engine, and published Chadwick's detection of the neutron that led to our fundamental understanding of the atom. So many discoveries over time which have fundamentally affected society. So in parallel to discovery and application, the Society has always played an active role in the science advice process, the process whereby science meets policy meets politics. And that goes back quite a long way in terms of influencing. The 17th century works of John Evelyn, one of our founding fellows, was to promote the planting of trees to tackle the problem of air quality in London. So the present day, in terms of the theme of the coming together of science, policy, industry, etc., the Royal Society is still very much in the business of giving practical advice to policymakers in the UK and overseas. We do this in the spirit of our predecessors, acknowledging that the challenges facing humanity are not limited to one country. So very much from a Royal Society point of view, science is global and effect on policy is not just limited to national policy. Research and innovation is very much these days performed by teams rather than individuals. And we do rather distort, I think, historically and presently. You know, I'm all for giving out gongs. I've had a few myself. But if you think of the vaccine pictures, the superstars who were leading it were in front of the television camera. What you didn't really see were the hordes and armies of lab technicians and research managers in the background, without whom none of this would have worked. So let's be clear that this is not about individual superstars, although they play an important part. So let me talk a bit about policy, and I'm going to stress a distinction, two things: science for policy and policy for science. And they're actually two different things. So science for policy is about providing scientific advice to improve or facilitate decision-making in government or agencies or whatever. It might be feeding directly into policy decisions, as scientific advisor, for example, to a government department, or as a scientist being a member of advisory groups such as SAGE. So put simply, science for policy is about connecting the expertise of those at the leading edge of science and technology to politicians, officials, opposition parties, and others involved in policy making and the legislative and debate process around it. So it's about applying scientific knowledge to shape things for the better. The second of the domains, which we call policy for science, is about creating the optimal environment so that the pursuit of science and research and innovation can more broadly thrive. So issues that come under that heading, policy for science, include making the funding system work better for science and technology, developing a supportive research culture and regulatory environment, and removing barriers to skills, migration, and international mobility. So two things: science for policy, policy for science. So very importantly, if we're to compete in a very competitive world, we need a well-supported system for the development, discovery, and application of science. So current issues, I've put this in two categories. What are the current issues in delivering high-quality science and technologies? Two categories: external factors and structural problems. So by external factors, I mean the issues in the global environment that impact either positively or negatively on science and technology. And structural problems, on the other hand, are what you might describe as frailties within the system that makes it suboptimal. So the first external factor, the marginal one I would highlight, is global competition. We operate in the science technology space. We operate in a competitive world, and also the pull through, obviously, to prosperity. So the UK has built up over many decades a highly successful and diverse science base. We turn out something like 13% of the world's most highly cited publications, despite having just 1% of the global population. And we rank 4th in the Global Innovation Index. And as we saw with the rapid development of the COVID vaccines, the proximity of our population to world-leading research and innovation has a direct and immediate impact on people's lives when we get something like the pandemic. So we start from a position of relative strength, but it is against the background of increasing competition for R&D talent and investment. So China and the USA, if you just look at the scale of investment in science and technology, it's kind of terrifying in the sense that you say, well, we can't compete, but we've got to compete. So countries that invest more heavily in science and technology are capturing and will capture a disproportionate share of economic and social benefits. Perhaps in the discussion, I'll go back to David Willett's initial point on 2.4, which I think is entirely misleading, but he's not here to debate it, so that's unfair. Now, the UK, which is in a stronger position than most, is likely to slip further behind unless our investment from public and private sources keeps pace with the competition. This has been made more difficult, let's be frank, by the uncertainty following Brexit. As David said earlier, no resolution in sight, maybe, but no, at the moment, no resolution in sight around the Northern Ireland Protocol. The final signing up of association to the European programs is still halted. And the longer that continues, as David hinted, the greater the risk of losing scientists to other countries. One statistic of 171 awards to people based in the UK from the ERC program, the EU made clear that the recipients could only get the EU money if they moved to an EU country. The Treasury underwrote the money for staying in the UK, but as a demonstration that it's not just about money, 26 of the 171 chose to up sticks and move to Europe. So there's potential of a brain drain as this uncertainty continues. A major factor regarding the environment for doing science and applying technology is consistency. The last few years, we've seen a number of science-related strategies launched across Whitehall. I think at one point there were 63 strategies on the books. We don't need this kind of piecemeal approach to national strategy in science and technology. We've got to somehow find something that will cohere with the aspiration announced recently by at least one government prime minister to be a science superpower. Consistency is absolutely vital for the science community. This creates the stability to pursue over a long enough time period the big ideas and discoveries. It also instills in the market investment confidence, which is needed to commit private R&D investment alongside the public. So big plea for a more joined up, consistent approach from policymakers. We're beginning to see that with the creation of the Office for Science and Technology Strategy in the Cabinet Office. But we must find a way of locking that in so that the long-term benefits can be realized. In terms of the structural problems, if we continue with the theme of short-termism, this really does get in the way. Short-term funding cycles across the system. And this, of course, runs up against, 5-year cycles of elections and governments. But it does end up, from a research point of view, with a community that lives somewhat hand to mouth in terms of 3-year chunks and the inability to plan long-term. We have created a new agency, the Advanced Research and Invention Agency, ARIA, which hopefully will invest in pursuing big ideas over longer timescales, and this would be a much welcome addition to the landscape. So a second structural problem is, if you like, the narrow incentives that have somehow shaped the culture of science in the UK. For those of you who are familiar, there is a regular cycle of a research excellence assessment for universities, and that determines the allocation afterwards of about £2 billion worth of funding to universities. But that what it does, is focus on recruitment and poaching, like in Premier League football, of the star principal investigators. And what that doesn't do is create incentives to institutions to recruit more open-ended technical and research associates and those at the interface of academia and industry. And I think from the perspective of those in this room, this is the major problem, the porosity, the fluidity of movements between academia and industry, which are much less kind of developed and fluid than they are in many of our competitor countries. So a further related problem is the way in which the current system weighs against interdisciplinarity in many ways, our ability of crossing traditional divides of disciplines in order to tackle global challenges. So as we go forward, I think the final structural problem I would mention is really that pull through to industry. There is if you count the creation of spin-offs from universities in the UK, it's not bad internationally on a competitive business. Where we absolutely fail is the long-term scale up of smaller enterprises into big global competitive enterprises. And that, I think, remains a major problem for us. So I will conclude just by saying we're at somewhat of a critical moment. In terms of international competitiveness, at the end of the day, it's about talent, and we have to be open and, in some sense, a magnet for the brightest and best global talent. And it's not absolutely clear that our immigration policies and rhetoric actually supports that and makes it very difficult to compete at that level. And the other thing is, could we not try to get a cross-party agreement on the fundamental importance of investment in science and research and remove the short-termism and the toing and froing of policy as we go forward? So those are a few thoughts which I hope are relevant to what we're talking about today.
Thank you very much, Adrian. I think just to pick up key themes, and I think starting off with the excellence in science, I think that's like a very important area, and which is also linked to something you mentioned on career and leadership in this space. And just to mention, also we'll have a session on career and leadership today as well, to delve into also more details. One of the key things I think that resonated with me is the challenges are not limited. The current challenges are not limited to one country, but are cross countries and international. And national policy has to take into account that interdependency, and national policy alone is not sufficient to address some of our challenges. Also, the distinction between policy for science and science for policy. So I think that there's plenty of themes which perhaps we can come to as well in our Q&A discussion in a bit. Thanks very much for that. So our next speaker is Tamara Finkelstein, who is permanent secretary at Defra and head of policy profession. Tamara is permanent secretary at Defra, having previously led the department's work on EU exit delivery. Before that, she leads the building safety program in the wake of the Cranfield Tower fire at the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. Much of her career has been at HM Treasury, where she started as an economist. She has worked in a number of other government departments on policy and delivery in health and children's services. Her board experience includes roles on the boards of NS&I, the Debt Management Office, and the UK Border Agency. I would like to invite Tamara on stage to present her talk. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Foundation for inviting me. And I will probably focus a bit more on science in policy making than policy for science, and other things be good to pick up in the conversation. Now, this is a very beautiful setting, and I've got some very strong memories of this building. I'm guessing that before you came down, you were maybe having coffee upstairs in what I think is called the River Room. And I first went there when I was 17, and I applied for a scholarship from the Worshipful Company of Scientific Instrument Makers to study engineering at university. And I came for an interview and had to enter at one end of that rather long room, and the interview panel was at the other end. And I still have that memory of a walk that felt like 10 minutes of my shoes clattering on the floor up there, getting to where the interview panel was sitting. And I'm amazed I got a word out, let alone a scholarship. But the second memory I have of this building is of this room. And this room is where I had my wedding reception 25 years ago. My main memory is that during the endless photographs that we were strengthened in the knowledge that while our guests were eating up the canapes, we had a special room, I think it's the library if you saw it upstairs, put aside our own protected canapes. But when we got there, some friends of my parents had discovered the nice quiet room, sat down and ate the canapes. And I'm not joking when I tell you that my husband has still very bitter, despite the passing of the years and the passing of many of the culprits. So I have a strong connection to this place. And the reason that we had our wedding reception here is that my father was a liveryman of this wonderful company. And there are three lessons I learned from him that have shaped my work as head of the government policy profession, where I've been working with Sir Patrick Vallance as the government's chief scientific advisor to strengthen the links between policy and the science and engineering professions. And the first lesson is the importance of science engineering and engineering. Now, my father was born in Lvov, which was then in Poland, and is now Lviv in the Ukraine. And at the age of 10, he was deported by Stalin to a forced labor collective farm in Siberia while his father was imprisoned in the Gulag. And he survived and found refuge in this wonderful country for which he and us are forever grateful. And he was interviewed about his experiences, and we have that as a very helpful record. And he was asked, what would he have become if the war had not happened? And he was part of a family that had actually lived in Lviv for over 200 years, a place to which he never returned. And he said, well, actually, I probably would have run the very successful family steel business in Lviv. But in Siberia, he and his mother struggled to survive the cold and the starvation, and very many people died. And he said he came to realize that the solutions to the most important problems of the world and the essence of life, food, water, energy, need engineers to address them. So that's what he became. The department I lead now, Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, has as its purpose to make our air cleaner, our land greener, our water purer, and our food more sustainable. My dad would have approved. And the issues that we tackle are not for Defra alone, they're not for government alone. They are big issues, some of which you'll be addressing later today. So net zero, which I think your next session is on, is a domestic and an international public policy challenge. It requires action on almost every front, moving to renewable energy, changing the way we use our land and produce our food, creating less waste, reusing our resources. Science and policy work hand in hand in government, in our domestic work, in our international work, to identify what works and to shape the research programs for what we don't yet know works. Adapting to climate change, something on which my department leads in government, is essential because we are already dealing with the impact of climate change, and more is to come, however successful we are in mitigating climate change. We need to build our buildings differently for a climate of extreme heat and cold. We need to build flood defences using great engineering, but also using nature-based approaches by planting trees in the right places, even reintroducing beavers. And from engineers to animal scientists, the policy solutions are grounded in the science. Food security, again, both a domestic issue, but more broadly, really an international issue, which then drives up food prices, requires an understanding of supply chains and the opportunities to improve productivity, including through precision breeding and automation. So for all these big questions, we need and have in government and in the UK some of the best mathematicians, scientists and engineering working hand in hand with policy professionals and collaborating with others, as I say, beyond government and worldwide. So lesson one, which you all know, science and engineering matters. The second lesson came from a very simple question that my dad would ask me. He said, "Where did you have lunch today?" And if the answer was, "I'd had a sandwich at my desk," he'd say, "That's the wrong answer." He was a great believer in finding the coffee room or canteen at the university where he worked, because that's where you would find colleagues from other disciplines. He was an engineer who worked with biologists to unlock the benefits of how body parts like the kidney work in the body as a system with feedback loops. He believed in the alchemy that comes from a multidisciplinary team, working across boundaries, embracing complex systems. When I worked in the wake of the Grenfell Tower fire on building safety and had to build a team instantly, I reached for the widest mix of professions and expertise. I needed engineers, I needed scientists, project managers, data scientists, mindfulness experts. I didn't know what the answers were going to be. I didn't even really know what the question was. We shaped our question. Our mission was how to make people in high-rise buildings safe from fire and the fear of fire now and in the future. I need people who understood materials, construction, data and human behavior. I certainly needed scientists and engineers, and they needed to operate in a program where we understood Parliament, government, money, etc. So my dad's lesson, most interesting problems are systems problems, and nothing can be solved alone. And in May, Patrick Vallance and I launched a systems thinking toolkit for civil servants to provide really practical ways to take a problem, break it into parts, and recognize and manage the relationships between those parts. Many of those tools takes 5 minutes to use, and then that can lead to deeper work as needed. And in the policy profession, we are in government, we're developing training on how to build a multidisciplinary team. I kind of have a frustration that sometimes we'll reach out to big consultancy firms, no dispersion on KPMG, but we reach out to some of these to consultancy firms, and they can very instantly, because their business depends on it, take the issue, size it, and work out what the kind of mixture of people that you need in order to tackle that problem. We don't really teach in government how to do that, and I'm particularly keen that policy professionals are really expert in that and know how to build those teams. We're piloting programs that bring professions together to learn the basics together of seeing policy through to delivery. By learning together, you also spend time together and build those relationships and community that my dad wanted me to develop over lunch somewhere other than at my desk. The third question comes from my dad trying to persuade me to write to the Worshipful Company of Scientific Instrument Makers, who gave me that scholarship, and update them on my career. But I was too embarrassed to do that because I didn't become an engineer. Now, it was a distinct possibility that I wasn't going to become an engineer, as I was always very fascinated by politics. And I worked for a year for Marconi Defence Systems, and they sent me as an engineer, and they sent me on an engineering practices course where my welding left quite a lot to be desired, but I learnt various things, and we all had to do a project. And everybody else, all the other students and apprentices I was with, built a machine that they could put in their car to tell them if the lights had been left on, because that was not an automatic thing that existed in your car. And I didn't do that. I built a voting machine to count votes using single transferable vote. So I think maybe at that moment I might have realized that my interests were at that time elsewhere. So I went into government and as an economist, and policy advisor. And it took me a long time to work out what I know now. But I use my science and engineering training every day to make better policy. I have to apply systems thinking, as I was saying before. I have to access and understand evidence and data. Even in writing policy advice, which is a really basic tool of a policy professional, I realized that the way in which I structure my advice is, what do I know? What model am I using? And what am I recommending as a result? And all that comes from my scientific training. So now, as head of the government's policy professional, I'm deeply committed to getting more people directly into policy who've got a STEM background, to ensuring that those who come into government as scientists have the opportunity for a spell in policy roles, and that the capability programme that we're building for policy professionals will include policy basics that are suitable for the wider set of what I say are policy makers. So we have policy professionals whose anchor might be in policy, but a much wider set of policy makers, which includes a range of professions, including scientists and engineers. So the three lessons from my dad are now shaping the policy profession. Science and engineering are critical to solving our policy problems. Multidisciplinary teams and systems thinking are crucial in successful policy making. And we need more scientists and engineers in the policy profession, and equip scientists and engineers to be policymakers. Now, I learned another lesson from my dad that's not really relevant to our subject. I'm going to gratuitously share it, and it's about the power of love. Because on that same video where my dad was asked what would he have been if there'd been no war, he also mused about meeting my mum, who he met in London after the war. She was born in Berlin and was a survivor of Belsen concentration camp. And he said, well, I do sometimes wonder where we would have met, but I think I know. I would have gone to Germany for postgraduate studies and we would have met there. There was no doubt in his mind that they were meant to be together, war or no war. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tamara. That was really amazing, and thanks very much for sharing also from your experience. I think there's some kind of key messages, some gold dust messages in your talk. I really like the point on alchemy that comes from working in multidisciplinary teams. I think that's really, really interesting, and the systems thinking approach to civil servants. I think that's a very, very useful document, which for my sins, although I am at KPMG, it's one of the documents I've shared very with like everyone around me. And my background, although we didn't, I jumped over it in the introduction. I worked on the National Digital Twin Program, which was run at Center for Digital Build Britain, and it was all about applying systems thinking in the infrastructure sector so we can improve the outcomes provided by infrastructure and how infrastructure operates. Just also wants to highlight that a lot of the challenge that was mentioned, like in terms of adaptation, mitigation, and net zero, food security, are all systemic challenges that hit all systems, and we can't address them by looking on one system. So we need to develop the tools and the enablers that allow us to understand that complex system of systems. So really looking forward to the Q&A session. I think there's plenty of really interesting threads to go onto. So thanks very much for that. So moving to the next to a next and third speaker, I'm really happy to introduce Professor Sarah Main. Sarah Main is Executive Director of the Campaign for Science and Engineering, where she leads dynamic organization that has shaped significant changes in public policy. She worked at the interface of government, parliament, and the science economy to put science at the heart of the UK's future. Sarah's background is in molecular biology and has worked with Cancer Research UK and the Medical Research Council, MRC. She later worked in strategy and funding at MRC and in government on public funding of science. Sarah has sat on a number of advisory groups for influential policy reviews, is a fellow of the Royal Society of Biology and a trustee of both the British Science Association and of the Foundation for Science and Technology. She is an honorary professor at UCL and Royal Academy of Engineering visiting professor at the University of Westminster. Sarah, if I could invite you on stage, please.
Good morning. It's lovely to be here today, and thank you to the Foundation for inviting me to join them. Thank you for that kind introduction, and I should declare an interest as a trustee of the Foundation for Science and Technology. So if I wax lyrical about how great they are, you'll know that I'm biased. But I do think it's really exciting to be here with you today, because the thing that the Foundation for Science and Technology has managed to do with the Future Leaders programme is to bring together a really diverse community of you all, professionals and experts from across these different communities that we've been talking about today, and you've heard about from the first two speakers, Adrian Smith and Tamara Finkelstein. So we have representatives in the room from government, from industry, from academia, and from all of those places and the interfaces between all of those. So I'd like to encourage you to make the most of the opportunity to be together today and of your Future Leader programme through the year, and to really think both today and through the year, what can you do? This is your leadership forum. What can you do to help us tackle these big issue problems that we're trying to sketch out for you today? So think of us as these speakers as just prompts for your own thinking about your role in, what is an exciting future. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Campaign for Science and Engineering, which I run, and then sort of set out these challenges for how we might meet, the opportunity of a more research and innovation intensive UK. I'm new to wearing glasses, so they might go on and off like quite frequently. I can't see what's on the page here. So as was said in the introduction, the Campaign for Science and Engineering is an organisation that's very young compared to the Royal Society and the Worshipful Company of Glaziers. We've been around for about 35 years or so, since about the mid-1980s. We are an advocacy group and an independent body made up of a wide variety of members and supporters, and as was said in the introduction, our mission is really to put science and engineering at the heart of the UK's future, and we do that by working at the interface between the R&D community and government and Parliament. The thing which is a joy for me in working at CASE, and I think is a really unique asset for CASE, is this breadth of its membership, and I think it's always an important reminder to think about how diverse the research and innovation community is in the UK. So we, across our membership, have a smattering of organisations from each of these different domains. And yes, they include academia, universities from across the whole of the UK, also research institutes of various kinds, industry from large to small, so from our multinational corporates to SMEs, to science parks, to property companies that invest in science parks, to early stage investment and venture capital companies. So a whole range of companies that operate in the business world. And then importantly, to our charities. The UK has a unique and really valuable community of research charities. There's a large preponderance of them in the medical research space, but there are many other charities that operate in the research and innovation space as well. And I'm really pleased that we've added into our membership more recently more public engagement institutions, so places like the Glasgow Science Centre. We have an observatory in the Kielder Forest in the northeast of England, which is a public engagement centre as well. So you begin to see, when you really think about what is research and innovation in the UK, how broad it is, and how it touches different communities. And it's a real pleasure for me to be able to talk to these hugely varied people that work in research and innovation in the UK. So we work by listening really to all of these different organisations and people from across the research and innovation sector, thinking about what it is that would make the UK a more attractive place to do science and engineering, what would help them to do their science and engineering better, and to bring that information together, to synthesise it and bring it into thinking in policy making in government and Parliament. I'm going to put some glasses on and off here now. So I'm just going to pause here for a moment and leave the slides alone for a second, but just to think about the topic of today, leadership in tomorrow's world, and this session is tackling the big picture. Well, you know, I've talked about my enthusiasm for you as our leaders of oh, I think that microphone's back. And I think what's exciting is your breadth of expertise and your breadth of connections. Now, for me, there is a really exciting moment happening right now, which is a kind of confluence of political will, investment commitments, and to some extent sort of public appetite that leads us to an opportunity where we have the potential for a decade of transformation in R&D. So in case we sort of use the term R&D decade to talk about this, but there has been over the last few years successive commitments from government that have really tried to increase our level of ambition as a country to be a more research and innovation intensive place. This has been termed the science superpower ambition by the Johnson administration, but it's come under different sorts of headings. Theresa May wrote it into the industrial strategy in 2016, 2017. And it has been prominent in manifestos by a number of political parties over the last few years. So I think there is some alignment politically. There is investment that has been made, although you know it's not always stable, and one must continue to make the case for that investment, which leads us to this opportunity. And I want to try and describe to you the scale of transformation that opportunity represents. In the language of the science superpower that Boris Johnson talked about, this is not a matter of growing the UK's R&D capability incrementally year on year in the way that it has done over the many, many decades past. This represents a transformative change, one where in 10 years, if we were to reach the goals that have been set out conceptually, we would be looking at a UK with a different economy and a different culture. And I think there's something, you know, very exciting to work towards in that. So for me, there are important questions there. Is it, you know, is this something that is worth doing? And if so, why? And you can think about, you know, what's your role in doing that? How do we do it together? So we know that we're in a difficult financial climate at the moment, and there have been many times over the past few years where that statement has also been true. You know, we've been through a number of difficult financial crises. If you were the Chancellor right now, if you had the power to decide, would you commit to increasing public investment in R&D at a transformative, you know, increasing rate over the coming years when many other priorities are need attention? And if you did decide to do that for very good reasons of looking for return on that investment in terms of economic growth and social benefit, what is it that you would want to get out of it? If you were going to commit the Treasury to this investment as a priority above all else, what would you want it to deliver? And I find it helpful to think 10 years ahead and think, well, you know, so what sort of UK would we like to be living in? What would you like to be different in 10 years' time that this kind of R&D transformation could help deliver? For me personally, I would like to see it deliver much more than an elevation of our R&D capability in a narrow sense. I would like it to deliver more than just better funded labs and more scientists and engineers. I would like to see it deliver, as I said, this sort of economic and cultural transformation, where there is a tangible benefit that can be felt not only by us in this room, but by, you know, our communities and our loved ones and our societies and our places where we live. That is a significant challenge, and I've been quite pleased really and heartened by seeing signs of that kind of ambition through recent government direction of travel, where we've seen R&D in part of bigger national programs, such as what was
termed, the levelling up programme, the idea of bringing greater prosperity to regions and places across the UK. We begin to see government really thinking about the UK's science capability as a national asset and thinking about how that can deliver more broadly for people. I personally think that that's a good thing, alongside the focus on delivering R&D for the sake of knowledge and innovation itself, but thinking about its wider benefits and how to really deliver those. But it takes really considerable coordinated thinking and perseverance across government in the way that we have just been hearing about from Tamara Finkelstein, to really align the sorts of different policy programs and efforts of many different government departments in order to deliver that kind of transformation. But I'm interested in also what would that mean to you? So, what would this decade's time, how would that look for you, and what would you want to see different? I'd like you to consider that. But importantly, I think that whatever it is in your mind that you'd like to see delivered, it will require this breadth of connection and breadth of network, which the foundation is beginning here to provide for you, and which I think you can make the most of in your year with the foundation. So please do cherish that and use it to its full advantage. So I think government has a few different reasons why it might want to focus on this idea of an R&D decade. We've heard about the sort of economic argument driving on UK competitive advantage, and the idea of delivering growth and innovation. I've talked a little bit about delivering on the national agenda. So I mentioned levelling up, but of course R&D can help deliver on, at least play a part in some of these other big challenges, like our place in the world globally and net zero, which we'll talk about later. And importantly, I think it's worth mentioning that a more research and innovation intensive UK can help government deliver better its own work. It can help departments deliver smarter public services, and that can lead to really tangible benefits for everyone in a really real way. So I've got a couple of points here that cover three areas: investment, education and skills, and science advice. I'm not going to dwell on them for very long, but we can talk about them further if you want to in the questions. But the thing that I will pick up on, because I think it might be a slightly different theme to the ones that we've otherwise will talk about, is the role of the public in supporting R&D investment. So I'm just going to run through these three slides quite quickly and then draw to a close. So challenges in supporting this R&D decade. The investment piece is critical. It is hard to create this kind of transformation economically and culturally without sustained long-term stability of intent, as Adrian Smith was talking about, that consistency and the sort of competitive level of investment. The challenges in delivering that, so not only this sort of cross-party alignment that we've mentioned, will one administration after another keep supporting this? It's also for us as a community to demonstrate the value of that, and in politically turbulent times to keep on demonstrating value and to demonstrate it in ways that really resonate with decision makers in government. There are enormous challenges in terms of growing R&D investment in the private sector, and it's sometimes somewhat overlooked that represents the vast majority of R&D investment and activity in the UK. So at least of the order of 2/3 of our R&D activity is done in the private sector. So thinking about growing private investment in R&D in a transformative way, by, let's say, doubling it over 10 years, it requires not only our R&D ambitions to be clear, easy to navigate and well funded, but it requires the rest of our sort of market environment to work as well. The UK must be an attractive place for businesses, full stop, as well as being an attractive place for R&D. I'm just going to quickly go on to the educational skills piece. The thing I want to say here is that I think if we are going to take a decade to transform the UK's economy and culture to be more research and innovation intensive, I think there are two different ways of tackling the skills part of that issue. One is to think about the pipeline of scientists and engineers cross-disciplinary sort of porosity between sort of different R&D career paths that will populate a more, a larger sort of R&D activity base. And the other is to think about the UK as a whole society and think, well, if we are, pushing on an R&D frontier, really accelerating that, how do we make sure that everyone is equipped to participate in that in various ways, as researchers and innovators, as citizens, users of innovation, as commentators, people that have a voice in public debate. And I think, this is where it's so vital to have a sort of whole society approach to the skills mission that goes alongside this R&D mission. And I think, we need to be able to identify the challenges and talk about them across the whole skill spectrum, from 5 to 19 education in schools, to immigration policy, to further and higher education policy, adult reskilling and so on. There's a whole realm of issues that are relevant to the UK using its science and engineering capability better, and growing that capacity in a way where people can really feel and appreciate the benefits. Now, I think that's an important piece. And lastly, those 2 words on the bottom, public support, I'll just dwell on for a couple of minutes. The case itself has spent 35 years thinking about advocacy towards government and parliament, and that has been our direction of communication. And we have thought for ourselves recently that we don't and haven't sufficiently at all thought about the public as stakeholders in advocacy for research and innovation investment. So, if we're going for a long-term cross-party ambition to keep driving up investment in research and innovation, I believe you have to have public support behind that, for that to be a long-term, politically feasible and tractable ambition. So that's a somewhat sort of self-serving argument that says, well, we need public support in order to maintain long-term growth in R&D investment. I think there's also a much more sort of democratic and sort of morally satisfying argument, which is that, if our R&D budget being spent from the public purse becomes bigger than our defence budget, is significantly large, then shouldn't the public have a voice in the conversation about its use and its sustenance and its value to us each as citizens, as well as people working in R&D. So I think there is a strong rationale for public voice and for understanding and trying to grow public support for research and innovation investment. There are many organisations that do public engagement in different ways, and they do a fantastic job. The approach that we are taking at CASE in a new programme of work, it's just called the Discovery Decade, is to use the tools of marketing and focus groups and so on. So we've been using polling, public opinion polling, focus groups and workshops to try and understand public opinion and to break it down into a more kind of nuanced, granular understanding of what different communities of people, young and old, in different parts of the UK, think about terms such as research, science, innovation, and what sort of rationale resonate with them for why they might support an increase or why they might support a decrease in funding for R&D. And that work is revealing really interesting findings, and we are looking to publish that early next year. So I encourage you to look out for it, and do get in touch with us if you want to hear more. My final slide is on science advice. I think given Tamara's talk, we've heard an excellent talk about that already. So I will just briefly say that it's, to me, a really important part of the whole R&D picture is how government uses R&D itself. It represents a large amount of public expenditure on R&D, and it represents huge potential in terms of value to the public. So I think I will draw to a close just there and say that, my hope and enthusiasm is for a genuine sort of national transformation. And I think you in this room can help us think about how to deliver that over 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Sarah. So just to highlight some of the key points in your presentation. So I think it was good to hear about generally the research and innovation ecosystem in the UK, but also about the idea of the R&D decades and the transformative change in R&D. I think particularly it was interesting to hear about the connection between investment in R&D, policy making around R&D, and the public voice, and some of the tools and community engagement kind of tools that you've employed to engage the public around R&D topics. So before we start and invite speakers back, we will also be joined by a fellow future leader on the program. So Dr. Alex Elliott. So Dr. Alex Elliott is a research fellow at Cranfield University as part of their 75th anniversary fellowship program. His background is in mechanical engineering, particularly complex vibration problems, and his current work focuses on using artificial intelligence and machine learning to enable high-efficient aerospace structures. Outside of his research, Alex founded and leads the Cranfield University Early Career Researcher Network and recently published in EPSRC's Tomorrow Engineering Research Challenges workshops. So I'd like to invite Alex, Adrian, Tamara, and Sarah to join the panel on stage. Sounds good. Sounds good. Great. Thanks so much. So before we start collating questions from the room and online, I just wondered if Alex, given you've been in the audience, if you have any reflections, thoughts on the three presentations we just heard.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Peter. I've written my notes down on my phone, so please apologies for me staring at my phone the entire time I'm discussing this. But I've tried to think of my role on this panel, and I don't quite have the expertise and experience of my fellow panelists, but I do have quite a strong connection with the early to mid-career stage. So I'm trying to take everything that I've heard so far and put it in that perspective, and hopefully some of it will resonate with you. But if not, please mention it in the questions, and I'd be intrigued to hear your thoughts as well. So there are three main points that I kind of wanted to reflect on, which kind of span everyone's excellent talk so far. The first of these is the importance of interdisciplinarity, and this was mentioned throughout, particularly for Tamara's team put together for the Grenfell challenge. And what that really highlighted for me is how many different skills need to come together and work together efficiently to really address these sort of big picture problems that we're talking about. And I'm going to be speaking quite often as my role as an academic. Hopefully that some of you will relate to that, but hopefully it should be relate to everyone's kind of point of view. And really, for me, the key challenge of the interdisciplinary work, not just trying to pronounce the word, but it's actually the funding side of things as well. And as Peter mentioned, I took part in the workshops for the Tomorrow's Engineering Research Challenges, and pretty much every discussion I had came back to which expertise aren't here, which would really allow us to solve the problems a lot more efficiently. And hopefully that's something that will start to permeate into funding as we move forward. But actually, this is something which is even harder when you come down to the early career stage. For instance, I took part in a recent sandpit, which the Centre for Doctoral Training for Infrastructure, Cities and Energy, CDICE, they're referred to as. This is a much smaller problem than some of the funding problems we've talked about so far. But actually what it does is bring together interdisciplinary researchers to try and put together their own £30,000 research project to try and promote themselves in the world of research. And it's an excellent program, and it's specifically designed to cater for the early career stage. But even something which is made for this kind of purpose, when you try and start talking to universities or other bodies about putting yourself forward as a leader in this position or trying to bring together these disciplines, we've found massive problems almost across the board in trying to allow yourself to start that leadership position. So that's, in terms of driving interdisciplinarity, it's something that happens across the levels, and hopefully we can start moving in a positive direction for that. That kind of leads on to my second point, which is about uncertainty. And I think one of the discussions that's sort of been underlying the entire program so far is the uncertainty relating to the sort of short-termism within government or politics or whatever field you're in, sort of that 5-year cycle of elections. And as an early career researcher, the idea of having 5 years to work on something sounds like a dream. That's a long-term position by my reckoning. So if you're on for instance, if anyone's a postdoctoral researcher, the chances are your contract is going to be somewhere between 1 and 3 years, which is really quite a tight timescale to try and establish yourself. And the uncertainty that comes from that is something that we're really trying to address with the early career researcher network I'm running. How can we try and drive change within our university and hopefully beyond to allow the best and the brightest of the early career researchers to be able to either stay within academia and the research problems, or to penetrate the world of industry and the civil service and politics as much as possible. And I think there was a real resonance when Adrian mentioned his comment on teams and how really science and technology comes from teams these days. And being part of those teams is important, but trying to find ways of promoting yourself within those teams and almost sort of holding your own when you don't really have that much of a track record can be a real challenge. And that's something which I think if we try and enable that side of the early career stage, hopefully that will help us have a much stronger team as we move towards tackling the bigger picture. And my final comment, which has been sort of touched upon but not mentioned explicitly enough as I think it should be, is the challenges that face trying to promote equity, diversity and inclusion, inclusivity, EDI. This is something that's being mentioned quite a lot in the world of research, and it's kind of expected that you should try and integrate it into your proposals and any discussions you have. But actually a lot of the time it still feels like it could almost be an afterthought, and it not necessarily is the forefront. And I think we're moving in the right direction, but there's work that needs to be done there, especially for tackling the big picture problems. And for my opinion, if you have a big picture problem at a national level, you need to hear from everyone within that big picture. Make sure all of the voices are heard, and make sure that everyone's expertise and also their lifestyles and their life in general is brought together to properly solve these big picture problems. And is there anything I wanted to say on that? Yes, so, and yes, I think this is something that comes into the science and technology policy we've been talking about so far. But actually, for the bigger picture, a lot of this will go beyond simply science and technology funding. And actually, all of the funding that the government makes, whether that be into education or community support, any kind of section that enables people to live their lives better is going to be put together a much stronger team for tackling these big pictures from a science and technology point of view. So that's my reflections. I'm sure hastily read from my phone, but yeah, I look forward to hearing the questions.
Thanks very much, Alex. I think some really important points, and I think raising the EDI angle is also very important in addressing big pictures. Just looking, if anyone has question in the audience, just raise your hand. I can see a few questions, so just start from. Sorry.
Thanks very much for great talks from everyone. Michael Hobson from the Department for International Trade. I noticed a few themes coming up, and particularly from a trade perspective, when the words prosperity or investment cropped up, my ears certainly pricked up. And it's really great to see that this sort of push is needed and recognized for R&D to really grow and the global technological frontier to really push forward. But also in the opening speech given for the whole day, we also heard about how China might be reaching for semiconductor production in Taiwan, and we're seeing this sort of global focus on national security really growing, especially in the space of S&T, where strategic advantages is quite obvious. So my question to the panel is this: how do we square the circle and wrestle with the tension of national security and prosperity to ensure the growth of R&D, but without exposing ourselves and our partners too much? Thanks.
Thanks very much. I think there's a question in the back.
Thanks very much. Dan Garbutt. So I'm a critical enabling strategies technical lead at Magnox for the continuous reactor dismantling. And amongst many things, I'm responsible for developing the research, development and innovation program to successfully achieve the mission and building a pipeline of beneficial RD&I. Our nuclear legacy is significant, and it's sort of developed over the 20th century with significant RD&I that's led to societal challenges that we face today. So I wanted to ask the panel what's being thought about within the systems approach, or to what extent is the systems approach reviewing this problem, that perhaps we take steps with our D&I today that causes further issues in the future. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Take one more question. So, sorry, Gavin, picking all extremes in the room.
Hi, Ginny Belson. I work in Lord Kaycar's office in the Thrombosis Research Institute. My question's kind of, it kind of poses sort of two sides of a different coin, in the sense that I think we agree that the REC exercise could be used not only to identify excellence, but also to identify areas of need and, you know, part of the levelling up agenda and what have you. And also there is a responsibility on the public purse to invest in more risky types of R&D where, you know, you might not get sort of private investment sort of leaping in as much in order to provide that type of investment. And I think one of the issues that I struggle with a little bit is with the, much as I believe in the Haldane principle, sometimes I think that you don't always get the policy need delivered by the research that's funded, and there's that sort of mismatch. And I just would be interested on the sort of panel's reflection. It kind of cuts across all your talks, which were, I should add, excellent. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So we have a question on investment and prosperity and the role with national security, and we have another one also on investment and how to ensure that where policy decided to invest, research will deliver along those lines. And I think it's a very, very interesting question as well on how do you apply systems approach on large critical national infrastructure with lots of legacy infrastructure and assets. So how does that apply? I'm wondering if on the first one on prosperity and investment, if Sarah, you'd like to pick up on that question and national security.
Why not? Yeah, I'm going to go. Hello. I'm sure the panelists will have thoughts on this as well. So yeah, thank you for the question from international trade. I think that in terms of international diplomacy, the UK's R&D capability is a calling card that we can use as a magnet. I think, as Adrian might have said earlier, you know, a magnet to attract others towards us, and a way to become a partner of choice globally. I certainly had conversations with the Chief Scientific Advisor at International Trade before about trying to strengthen the way in which the government can represent our R&D capability in a way that's appropriate to international partnerships and discussions. And I'm sure that's really live at the moment post-Brexit with, you know, establishing these new trade deals and international relations. And from what I've seen, and I'm not hugely close to it, that does seem to be improving. And I think, you know, has, you know, the prominence of our R&D capability, I think, is moving up in the minds of diplomats and so on as part of the overall offer of the UK. I think your specific question was more about the tension with national security. So from where I sit, which is outside of government, and you know, I'm an observer outside, I'm not as close as others might be, including yourself. This seems to me to be a really very important area for discussion, where I think, you know, the whole concept of what we're doing today, which is bringing people together from different communities, is fundamentally important to try and navigate this very difficult issue. And again, from standing at the outside, what I think I'm seeing at the moment is a sort of mood and a set of conversations and direction of travel within government in the UK and other governments globally, and a sort of different set of conversations and direction of travel within academic research, which has been driven by government nudges and hints over many years along the lines of the impact agenda. So, our REF, our Research Excellence Framework, has looked to universities to attract third stream income, has valued highly partnerships and collaboration with business and so on. So universities quite rightly are pursuing their strategic goals in line with a set of guidance around research excellence. And I think there is a risk at the moment for those two conversations to somewhat diverge if those communities don't come back together and talk more openly and more frequently. So I think a platform, a home and a platform for that kind of debate is really important. I know there have been some examples over the last year, and I think your department, perhaps some others, have been involved in bringing people together to have these discussions, which I think is terrific. I don't think that discussion has really reached right across the academic community, into lab benches and so on yet. But I think there are encouraging signs with tools being created by UKRI and by government and others. I just feel there's a lot further to go to really kind of surface quite difficult discussions and the views of these communities to navigate this question.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Just wondering if the second question on how can systems approach be applied to legacy and critical national infrastructure like the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority. So how could we approach how could we take a systems approach to, for example, improve the way decommissioning of large nuclear facilities is ongoing while taking into account environmental aspects, et cetera, et cetera. Not sure if Tamara, you may have some thoughts on that.
Okay. One of the mics will work, I suppose, if I hold this. I'm not sure. Clearly, I think there's two aspects to this. One is about having to take a systems approach to that sort of issue. The other is how do we ensure that we take long-term, to have a sort of degree of long-termism to what we do. That I think is a really good challenge. And some of that is about ensuring that we kind of bring the skills to any of these conversations that look at things both in that systems way and in that long-term way. It's quite a challenge in government. I think you mentioned about the 5-year cycles, and it's quite a challenge actually within kind of government where we are working for the government of the day, and yet some of the issues that we are dealing with are very long-term issues, and we're very much developing our kind of capability to advise with a very kind of long-term, much more long-term approach, and developing those really long-term ways of thinking, which I think are really important for an issue of this kind, and bringing those kind of systems thinking approach. I don't have much expertise in the specific issue that you raised, but lots of things that we deal with do have those very long-term those kind of very long-term consequences, and ensuring that we build a kind of policy making framework that does that is important. Just on that kind of being, how do we make sure that we are doing the research that helps us with those long-term issues? Pretty much all departments, I was looking up the other day for something, have now put out their areas of research interests, which they didn't used to do, and that hopefully provides a really good basis for people to be thinking much more long-term about the research that might be needed in the future, and it makes policymakers think in a much more disciplined way as to what are my long-term needs. And when I worked in the Department of Health with Chris Whitty, he wasn't named Chris Whitty from the telly, but he was a chief scientific advisor at the Department of Health, and you'd come and go, Chris, I need evidence for a bit of policy that I want to tell the minister to do tomorrow. And he'd say, I'll see what evidence there is, but only if you promise to be part of a workshop where we look at what will you need in 5 years time, in 10 years time, and so on, and take that much more long-term approach. So a slight aside to your question, but I think that approach to systems thinking and looking long-term where we're trying to develop our skills are part of the answer to your question.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And I think the point I think been picked up several times is how to balance between the short-termism and the long-term planning and the needs for that long-term planning. There's a question from our audience. There's a question from our audience online on the challenges to enable interdisciplinary research and what are some of the ways to address that and overcome such challenges. I'm wondering if, Adrian, you may have some thoughts.
I think you can do it.
Can you hear me without the mic? Yeah. I'm going to cheat and just go back very briefly to the first question, which you could phrase as tension between sort of sovereignty and existing in a global context. And I think that the thing you have to think of there is go back to something simpler. What's in the national interest? If you take defense and security, which above all you would say is a sovereign thing, we do it by cooperating with some people, not others. And the same thing with research. The international cooperation and 4 decades worth of working with Europe, you can demonstrate that the quality of research has been enhanced by that. So the national interest is served by international cooperation in many instances. So it's not a tension if you look at it the right way. Now remind me what I'm supposed to be answering.
No, so on the
interdisciplinary.
That's right.
Yeah. I could briefly, nobody came back on the Haldane thing. I think it's a mixture. You've got to fly the flag for basic discovery research. You've got to have spaces in which people can just do curiosity things, but it's absolutely appropriate, of course, if you've got a crisis in government that you can spend money on a thing. So it's a balance issue, I think. So now what I'm supposed to be talking about is interdisciplinarity. I don't think there's a sort of magic wand here, but you could point to certain things in the UK systems which go in the wrong direction. Some of that is in the education pipeline. Those of you who read the Times, I had a letter in the Times the other day. We do need a dramatic reform of the education pipeline system to something more like a baccalaureate system and stopping the divide at 16, where half the population, in a sense, gives up on half the disciplines. So that's not a recipe for interdisciplinarity or awareness. So that's one issue. The other issue, perhaps, looking internationally, is the structure in universities, where universities are dominated by admissions to a discipline. Whereas if you go into most institutions in the United States, you've got a much more fluid environment. You can do major subjects, minor subjects, combined subjects. So I think part of it lies in the education system. And then the other part lies, in some sense, in the funding system. So if you chunk up, UKRI into the Medical Research Council, the Environment Research Council, you in danger of having sort of narrow constituencies addressing problems. So one thing, just a suggestion, the original intention of UKRI was perhaps to be a more strategic focus for the research base, and perhaps getting many more things into UKRI level decision making would also help this. And then you get down to the level of people, and you have to look at what are the career incentivizations. And if the incentivization is to go narrow and deep, and that's how you get your promotion and you're gone, that's what people will do. So all those things.
Thanks very much. And before we go to another round of questions, I just wanted to pick up on one thing which we've touched on across the presentation, and maybe this could be said as the enablers for interdisciplinarity or enablers for systems thinking. I think, Tamara, you gave an example or a story from how the coffee in a university is a place where everyone comes together. We also touched on the importance of data and information flow between different parties. So we touched on it in terms of the investors, the public sector, and the public, so general public as well, in the R&D space. I was just wondering, what are the equivalent of the coffee shops that could facilitate more joint thinking between industry, academia, and government? And is there a need to look into new institutions in that space, or is it more of enhancing the connection between existing institutions? I'm just wondering if anyone would like to pick up on that. Maybe yeah, Tamara, I'm not sure if you may have some reactions, but anyone from the panel.
I mean, I'm probably less well
Okay.
placed in terms of knowing the kind of institutions, but the thing is, I do believe very deeply is that this is a people game, and so you have to find the places in which people can make those connections. I think that there is more in the science space. I think policy and science of making more connections with academia. I think that's kind of feels an easy connection. I've got quite a lot of examples and some of the kind of institutions, but then usually still again reaching across with academia and much less so with industry. So I would love to have a better way in which we were reaching into industry as well, and maybe that's through the sort of institutions we do have connections with, the Royal Academy of Engineering or the Royal Society, but how do we ensure that the people who we come across there are more often in academia, I would say, than industry. So there's probably something to do there. I'd agree with you.
Yeah, thanks so much. If there's no more reflections, maybe I'll take another round of questions. Sorry, the lady.
Hello there, Rosa Wilkinson from the High Value Manufacturing Catapult. A key challenge, it seems to me, is how we breathe interdisciplinarity and that team spirit that you have been talking about, particularly across the boundaries between industry and the research base. For me, very often that comes down to language. I wondered whether the panel had any reflections on whether people who are studying science disciplines also needed to be trained in storytelling in ways that would help them articulate their vision, their ideas better, both to industry and government. Do we need a translation service?
Thanks very much. Sorry. Okay, yeah, we'll take one from there and then come here.
Thank you. Andrew Mackenzie from the Physiological Society. We've talked a lot about bringing people together and the importance of interdisciplinary working. Can our research structures and systems do that at the moment? We've got a system that often values being an expert in one particular area, but we've got mission-led research objectives and agenda from government that then often doesn't land successfully when it hits the actual research landscape. So does the government need to be more interventionist in setting up new institutes to tackle some of these big challenges that forces the bringing together of people rather than leaving it to the whims of the research ecosystem?
Thanks very much. And third and last question.
Thank you very much. To add to another question on interdisciplinarity then, I'm a professor at Loughborough University, to say my background there. So with the interdisciplinary work that we're talking about, this focus on science is perhaps at the detriment of the creative arts and creative thinking, and yet as scientists, we also rely on that creative thinking. So I'm wondering on your opinions on how we get that balance right, how we promote our science, but also we want that help from the creative arts, and how do we balance that together within our policy influence? My background, I'm the Director of Knowledge Exchange and Innovation in the School of Design and Creative Arts in Loughborough University. We offer a master's in storytelling. Our designers are required to have either electronics, maths or physics before they come to us on an undergraduate program. So we work very interdisciplinary as a school and blend those two things together, the science and the creative arts science.
That's great, and already a connection made around storytelling. So I think the point on the balance between kind of behavioral sciences and research is a very interesting one, and touches also on the first question, which is storytelling, translation, making research more accessible to industry, understanding what's kind of trying to achieve in a better way. I'm just wondering if anyone has kind of reflections on that, and wondering if maybe start, Alex, to get your thoughts on that topic.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start by talking about interdisciplinarity in general from my perspective. What I find the key challenges to be is sort of twofold. The first is the kind of networking opportunities, for instance, like events like today, where you can meet people who you would never talk to, even in the university level. We're still quite siloed between our departments. if you've never talked to these people before, even in a social setting, you have no idea who's out there basically, and who you could be working with. And I think that relates to that storytelling aspect, in that if you're speaking to people more often with less of expertise in your area, you get used to telling people these ideas you have in ways that they understand. So I agree that storytelling training is definitely an excellent way to go, but I think having just general conversations with people who are experts in other areas, enabled through these sort of coffee house events, that kind of thing, or just randomly bumping into people, is another way of developing that skill set, and probably an approach that it combines both is probably the most satisfactory point of view. The second point comes down to one of opportunity, particularly at the early career stage. As an early career researcher, that you're quite limited in the funding you can apply for. Just generally, if you come out of your PhD, if you're anything like me, you do 3 works of your PhD, and then you've planned out another 3 works of things that you now know what you're talking about, and you could potentially carry on researching that forever if you wanted to. But there isn't that kind of individual mechanism for allowing this for a lot of people. So that's one perspective I think needs to change. But actually, funding specifically for interdisciplinarity is really key. And I think that starts by funding events, again, like this one, where you just put people together and let them talk. And it may be some kind of mission focus, or it might just be some sort of general network. Basically bring people together to build up their sort of parallel expertise. Once you start having that as an initial step, you need the funding mechanisms to back that up. And the CDICE program I talked about before is great. And just a bit more detail, it's a seed corn funding project where groups of sort of 3 to 5 early career researchers can come together and ask for £30,000 worth of funding. And if you've done anything with academic funding before, you'll realise that goes very little in terms of planning a project together. The idea is that you're supposed to put together a new project which is much bigger, bring in other expertise. But that's kind of where the journey ends from a funding perspective, because there isn't that opportunity that you're sort of eligible as a small group of early career researchers to apply for. And if you want to start trying to bring in industry or civil service, again, there's an extra level of challenge there.
Yep.
So does that vaguely answer the question? I've kind of lost track of what the question
No, I think there are.
Those are the ideas I have on the topic.
Thanks very much on that. And I think we're running close to end of time, but I thought just before we wrap up, it would be good just to do one round of closing remarks from the panelists, maybe starting this direction this time. So Adrian, just wondering if you have a few thoughts as closing remarks.
Well, I'll cheat and use part of the closing remark as an answer to question. So the interdisciplinarity, part of it is to do with the education system. I really think that is absolutely fundamental. The other thing is, do we need perhaps some new structures, some new creative ideas? So we've got 4 national academies in the UK, the Royal Society, Royal Academy of Engineering, British Academy, Academy of Medical Sciences. They're separate boxes. And the average age of election to the Royal Society is about 60. So don't hold your breath for a minute. So what we're trying to do, the 4 academies, we're launching the idea of a young academy, which will cut across a single academy, across all disciplines. And not only disciplines, actors, musicians. I was once asked, can trapeze artists apply? And the answer is yes. To get a community, a new community, starting off with building up to a couple of hundred, whose raison d'etre for joining and being in that is to network with others in an interdisciplinary way, looking from that younger age perspective at all the issues we're talking about today. You know, I probably should be in a box and not allowed to talk about these issues, because what happens in 20 years' time, I'll be looking from afar under the ground.
Thanks very much. Really interesting young academy idea. I think probably lots of people in the room will find that very, very interesting and appealing. Tamara, maybe.
Thank you. That does sound a great idea. I mean, everything's always all about how do you build communities of people, and sometimes through the kind of institutions that we have, but just encourage people, like you say, you're here today, form a group of you that have something in common and just be together. And I do think that learning together is a really key thing, and actually learning storytelling together is one of the most effective ways I've seen of bringing people from different areas together. I've done a number of programs that brought different people from different bits of public service together who actually have very different language, and using training on storytelling as a way in which to both learn the storytelling technique, which is totally crucial, and build those connections. And I just want to touch on that point about creative, for the creative arts and so on. One of the things that we've been doing, we had something called Policy Lab, where we try different approaches to kind of policy making. We've been using anthropology and kind of film making based on sort of anthropological ideas and techniques to help get a sense of kind of impact on the citizen, user-centered design, and have been really involved with various people in kind of design and creative areas to improve our policy making. So I think it's a crucial part of the puzzle. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And Sarah?
Thank you. Is this microphone? Yeah, that's all right. I think given that I've got the last comment here, I think I'd just ask you to go back to thinking about your 10 years time, whatever it is for you. What would you like to be different about your society, your community, about the UK, and what can R&D do to help achieve that? And from the questions we've just heard in the room, you get a sense that some of you at least are looking for, a more connected society. And that's something that, I would certainly welcome, where, if in 10 years time, your children and your auntie and your grandma didn't see science and engineering as something different and other, or something difficult, or something not for them, but that people in general in the UK just found it a much more integrated part of life. And if that were the case, then I think a number of these questions that you were asking would be more easily achieved. So yes, we would be able, to achieve that, we will all have to be able to be better at talking to each other, at connecting with other communities, connecting across our scientific communities, and connecting outwards, and embracing and including, everybody in the pursuit and the sort of enjoyment of research and innovation as a way of asking questions. And I would just say on the creative arts thing, I just wanted to clarify, I think Adrian did this at the beginning, that often when we use the word science, we are using it very, very broadly. And of course, the government uses it to embrace all of research and innovation. So UKRI, which we've talked about, of course, does support artists and creative arts and researchers. And I think many of us talk about it in that broad way, but sometimes we forget to say we are. So certainly we need to be clear that we're embracing, the whole mindset and pursuit of asking questions in the way that we talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was pretty fascinating first session and very, very insightful. Hope everyone in the room enjoyed it, and also people online. The laptop is unfortunately dead, so I'm not sure if it's all fine. But if you could all join me to say thank you to our panelists and speakers.